Good morning, family. Welcome to African Esquire and on the WCC channel. Sorry, let me fix my camera. I think that's a little more straighter. I am so sorry I am late. It's one of those days, the daycare struggle. Try to get your child to daycare on time. But we do have something important to talk about today. I hope everyone's doing well. Good morning to you. Malema took the bags. Well, let me just first say, so the title of this video is what happened to the EFF being the economic freedom fighters in South Africa. It is known as a populist party, political party inside of South Africa. It's not going to be a video like slamming the EFF. I've said many positive things about them in the past. I will continue to praise them where they should be praised. But I think at the same time, we have to understand the limitations of political organizing inside of states that are colonial states. And I think the EFF is a good example of this, because I don't think anyone would argue that a lot of their actions may be well-meaning, and particularly in the beginning, when they're pushing for land expropriation without compensation, that was something that was of good-hearted towards the people of South Africa. However, because of the landscapes that we exist in as African people inside of colonial states, we'll be oftentimes forced, I think, if we want to survive in the political arena, forced to do things that many we might see as concessions. So that's really what we're going to talk about. Like I said, it's not going to be a slam of them. I'm sure it wouldn't bother them if I did, but, it's not going to be a slam of them. It's just going to be a reflection on what we have to look at as really the center of liberation, struggle. And that's something that I want to focus on today. So I hope everyone is doing well in the chat. It looks like everyone's good. Looks like my sound is good. Okay, I think we can get started. So I'm just going to get started by playing a clip, because when I say what happened to the EFF, I want to be clear that for many people inside of the Pan-Africanist movement, particularly of a certain age, we missed a lot of the greats. We missed people like Kwame Ture. We obviously, unless you're of a certain age, you probably missed Kwame Nkrumah. You probably missed a lot of the people who we talk about all the times who are in our readings and things like that. And because of that, we have a really dim prospect whenever you look at the landscape as far as people who are visible. And visibility does not necessarily mean that the person is organizing, but visibility does mean something in the minds of in the subconscious of Africans, because if all we can see when we turn on the news, when we go outside, all we can see is oppression and we have no one offering alternatives, then yeah, visibility does become important. I think sometimes we de-emphasize visibility because we understand visibility without concrete action and organization is really just a show. So in that type of arena, we can see that the EFF had so much prospects. This is like the first big movement that we've seen in a while at the time. I think there's been other movements, Pan-Africanist movements, that have come up since then. But at the time, I mean, what was it, like mid 2000 or 2010s, around that, 2012, 2011s. We hadn't really seen like a lot of people who were talking boldly towards the colonial construct and had the people to back them up. That's the key, like having people to back them up. So because of that, many of us were very happy to see someone bold and proclaiming messages like this one.
Who must be allowed to divide Africa. Our struggle is to liberate the whole of Africa. We want the resources of Africa to benefit the people of Africa, and not the West, and not the East, and not those who come outside Africa. Let us go and help Africans to get their land, to get their minerals, and use their minerals for the survival of African continent. If you hate Zimbabweans, or you are not going to vote for the EFF because I say we must love Zimbabweans, please do that. If you're not going to vote for us because we love ourselves so much, then you can go away with your self-hating vote. Papa. Mazimbabwe ki mira. Ari lebeleti Mazimbabwe ribona siponi. Reake pona. Ari lebeleti any African, a Nigerian, a Ghanaian, all over because the pain of Africans is our pain, not only here, even abroad. Those in the diaspora, those people are suffering. They are harassing them. They've got no right. In America, it's even worse. That Donald Trump hates Africans.
So I actually posted this on this channel. Oh, I think it was, see how long ago this was. This was 2019, so about 3 years ago. So I posted this on this channel and said Pan-Africanism lives on, because we know that we're in a day where people say lies about Pan-Africanism. One of the big lies that people say about Pan-Africanism is that it's something that only the diaspora talks about, that the diaspora is hoping for Pan-Africanism. Africans are not thinking about Pan-Africanism, or Africans do not look at themselves as African. They look at themselves as Nigerian. They look at themselves as, a Ghanaian. They look at themselves as Zimbabwean. So they don't look at themselves as African. They look at themselves as these colonial borders that have been created by the oppressor. That's something that was a lie that was being floated around the internet. Some people still try to float it around. So because of that, I thought that was a great example of no, number one, many Africans do not look at themselves as just their national identities. Many Africans do believe in Pan-Africanism. Many Africans, and I'm saying continental Africans, many continental Africans do believe that Pan-Africanism, the uniting of Africa with the diaspora, that is what we must fight for. And I don't think that that's necessarily what the EFF has left necessarily, but they're doing some things that I think are concerning, for which we have to be very real and call out. So this came out, I believe it was last week. Let's look at this video. So just to set some context, essentially, and I'll read an article for more context, but essentially there's been some complaints inside of South Africa, as there has been, we've heard of many times, about Zimbabweans who are basically taking jobs from indigenous people in South Africa, or the native South Africans, whatever language you want to use, the national people. And because of that, there's EFF basically went down to some restaurants and started surveying them to find out what is the composition of Zimbabweans versus, or non-South Africans versus South Africans working inside of your restaurant. So I'll play this video.
The message is very simple. Let African brothers and sisters work together with South Africans. No employer should exclude South Africans in the name of our African brothers and sisters, because that is instigating the xenophobic attack on our sisters and our brothers. And we don't want it. We know the cause. And the cause is not our African brothers and sisters. The cause is the employer. That's why when we are here, we are confronting the employer, and not the innocent African brothers and sisters who came here looking for greener pastures. I made an appointment to come see today.
Yeah, look, the journey was confirmed. Yeah. Look, we've been advised that we are not in a position to meet with you because you're not on any official government business. However, we do have a letter for you. Sorry, I'm keeping it under because of the rain. So you're more than welcome to send us any questions you've got in writing. We will respond to you.
I don't want the letter. Okay. I'm here to meet you, and I'm coming peaceful.
Okay. Yeah. What would you like to discuss?
No, we can't discuss here. We made an appointment to meet.
Okay, I'm going to fast forward in the video.
The problem is that people come to you so peaceful.
Sorry, a little bit of delay happening on my end, but I'm going to fast forward to close to the end.
Well satisfied
Back a little more.
At this stage, there is no meeting, but I'll come back.
Your business at risk. Yeah. You're going to affect everybody. That's fine. Yes. Well, the member of parliament.
We want to bring in.
There is another member of parliament there.
We happy. It's myself and my father. So it's all three of us. We have
1, 2, 3. Just follow these people. Yeah.
No camera.
These ones are from the website. Yeah, they always look for outcome.
I think that'll be fine. Okay. Let me throw it around.
We were well satisfied that they are adhering to what we are looking at. The cream has got almost 50-50 type of narrative, but uninterested majority in South Africa. We want to make an emphasis, and that's what we said to the owners of the restaurant, that no one should stop employing Zimbabweans here and say the EFF said they want Zimbabweans. We want Zimbabweans to work here in South Africa. It is their home. They should make no apology about hiring Zimbabweans or any other African brother or sister. But in doing so, they must be well considered that they are locals who must at all times be given a preference.
Okay, so many of you probably heard this and said, oh, there's nothing wrong with what he's saying. Let's investigate it a little bit more, or not investigate a little bit more. Let's think a little bit more deeply about the implications of what happens here. So it says the EFF's apparent U-turn on Pan-Africanism raises questions about its stance on immigrants. The economic freedom fighters have recently come under fire for what appeared to be backtracking on their historically pro-immigrant political stance. Amid this principled confusion, how do the party's most recent actions fare against their past? The EFF's leader, Malema, made the rounds on January 19th at the Mall of Africa to inspect the employee list of various restaurants, apparently with the intention of assessing the ratio of foreign-born to local employees working at these establishments. The action, accompanied by a call from Malema to hire more locals, prompted many to question whether the party had abandoned its previously established stance as a Pan-Africanist organization that once called for the abolishment of South African borders. Human Rights Watch reported in 2020 that xenophobic harassment and attacks against non-nationals in South Africa were widespread and committed by citizens, police, and politicians alike. Looking at the EFF's position paper, their least populist political stance has been in their support for African immigrants and the condemnation of their subjugation. So what is this saying? Well, EFF has a fan base, or not a fan base, they have a political base. The political base, they agree with their other policies. They agree with the land expropriation without compensation. They agree with maybe the Pan-Africanist stances, but they do not agree with the idea of having Zimbabweans and Nigerians and other non-South Africans inside of their country, able to do the stereotype that I've heard. And of course, I can't speak on it, but I'm sure that there's reason for this. I'm sure that there are examples of this. The stereotypes that we hear are that people who come into South Africa, they start crimes, they might be involved in illegal activities. Well, that's something that we know very well is associated with people whenever you have to flee for your lives, you're going to basically be pigeonholed economically inside of a position where the people are going to cause possibly some catastrophe. And this is just a social truth. You don't oppress a people and think that those people are going to necessarily be able to break out of that oppression, particularly whenever the foot of their oppressor's neck is still on their neck. Now, that is something that we always have to keep context around. Absolutely, we understand that having any crime inside of our communities, yes, that's not something that we want. But we also understand that crime is not something that happens in and alone of itself. It's something that is driven by the conditions, the social conditions. And we also know that things that are labeled a crime for our people are not necessarily going to be relevant for the dominant class. They have their own actions that are illegal, but they tend to escape scrutiny. So for example, you might have some Africans who might do something like, let's say they rob some store or something like that, right? They are held to a higher standard than the people who crashed the world's economy in 2008. And I say the world's because America's economy is the world's economy. They will be held to a higher standard for that one store because what they do is going to be seen as basically low level crime that can be subject to social isolation, whereas the people who will literally crash the economy of the world get to walk free and enjoy their lives. This is the reality of the fact that our people are put inside of a situation where we're being labeled as criminals by way of the social conditions that we have been locked into. So yes, I understand that there might be some concerns, but the problem is when you identify the result, you identify the symptom of a sickness as the sickness in itself. So if immigrants are coming to South Africa and they are committing crimes more than the locals, is it because they are criminals just in and of themselves, or is it because the conditions have driven them into that? I would argue that, knowing South Africa for even national, local South Africans, the conditions in that country are creating a lot of the behaviors that we see as a result. You don't have a people who are landless, locked into townships that are poor, without any water, some places, without housing, adequate housing. And yet you have a very small minority owning the vast majority of the land in the country. And you don't do that and think that things are going to be peaceful. You know, whether or not the agitation is going to be protest or organizing, or whether it's going to be petty crimes, it will never be peaceful. Poverty, oppression, locking people out of the economy, allowing people to live a subhuman existence, that will never be peaceful. It's either going to be unpeaceful for our oppressors, or unfortunately, if we're not organized to challenge the oppressor, it will just be not peaceful for us. So that's what we have to keep in context when we're talking about issues with immigration. But for whatever reason, a lot of the South African nationals, things like we hear about in America, right? Whenever people talk about immigrants, they say they're taking our jobs, they're committing crimes. These are the same things that we hear, right? Those are the same things that are happening in South Africa. And this has been the EFF's least popular position, the fact that they have advocated for ceasing the recognition of national borders, something that we know is a necessity for Pan-African unity. You know, if you think you're going to have Pan-African unity by adhering to colonial borders that were intentionally drawn to ensure that your independent African state does not have access to or does not have the ability to be self-sustaining. That was the literal construct of the literal intention behind the drawing of the borders. We want to make sure that these people are not self-sustaining, that they depend on us. If you think that we're going to reach some type of prosperity without dropping these borders, you know, as a people, you're just not thinking realistically. So this, as the article says, let's just go on. It says, during the party's 2019 general election manifesto launch, Malema envisioned a South Africa free of xenophobia in his address. In that address that was resoundingly applauded by EFF members in attendance, Malema called for borderless Africa. Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Botswana, and the DRC as our home, he said. He says, we were divided by those who imposed borders on us. Those borders were imposed on us by the colonizers. We are one people. He said, telling his fighters, let us not be too local. Let us be international. We exist in a globe. Let us not be too isolationist. I'm full Pan-Africanist mode when he went on to say, let's stop xenophobia. Let's stop self-hate. If you attack others, you don't love yourself, he said. And he also goes on to say that the resources in Africa should be used to benefit Africans and not benefit white people, right? These are things that we agree with. The problem is, though, that the EFF has had a lot of backlash from that. I don't know if any of you were paying attention to when Burna Boy, the African musician, he had voiced that he, as a Nigerian, when he went to South Africa, was treated so ill that he never wanted to go back to that country again. And at the same time, I think it was scheduled to go to like a big festival in South Africa. And so whenever this happened, it caused so much backlash, particularly from the South Africans. They're like, oh, really? Well, don't come. And Julius Malema jumped out of there and said, I support Burna Boy. He is a son of Africa. He's welcome to come into South Africa and all this. And he took a hit for defending Burna Boy. He took a real hit. Now, this is a problem whenever you consider the fact that, again, your base, even though they agree maybe with some of the principles of Pan-Africanism, they may not agree with a borderless Africa. They may not agree with the xenophobia language or narrative, because they say we're not xenophobic. We just don't want criminals inside of our land. they might not agree with a lot of these things related to immigrants, because since there's so little economic prospects inside of a country like South Africa, you have a lot of people who are poor South Africans basically battling it out with other people from outside. Now, the problem that I really had with Malema's stance in the video, and like I said, I don't think it sounded good, right? He goes to the restaurants and he says, well, we're not trying to target our brothers and sisters who are Zimbabwean or whatever. We're trying to target the restaurant owners. And the restaurant owners are the ones who are going to put pressure on to hire native South Africans. We understand, though, why is it that Zimbabweans or other immigrant groups will take these types of jobs or will be more preferred. It's the same thing like in many countries, America, Europe, whatever. It's that whenever you're an immigrant, basically you can get paid under the table. You might not have taxes. You'll take low wages, right? So because of that, you might have Zimbabweans basically who are willing to take half the amount as a South African, right? And because of that, the businesses will hire more Zimbabweans. The problem with that analysis and stopping there and say, well, we need 50-50. Well, yes, I can see what you're saying if the situation in itself was one that we wanted. Do we want to depend on these businesses that many times are not comprised of African people who are in the leadership of these businesses? Do we want to be in a position where we're relying on them to do right by us in our own lands, on our own indigenous lands, on our own soil? Or is the question not, well, you need to hire more of us? The question is, we need to make sure that we're able to control our own economic commerce. So essentially, blaming the issue of hiring Zimbabweans, the issue is that you're not sovereign in your own land. That's something that goes beyond whether or not who's getting hired. If they hire more South Africans, guess what? You're still not sovereign. You're still not in control. You're still economically handcuffed. Yet the analysis stops short of that. That's something I've been noticing pretty frequently with the EFF as of late. And I think the reason why, and we're going to talk about more of that, is because of the basically the failure that happened as far as pushing for land expropriation without compensation. We're going to talk about that a little bit, and also talk about it in light of this is what we have to be cautious of whenever we're entering into national politics, because you have the EFF trying to walk a thin line. They understand that their base is not appreciative of their pro-immigrant stances. So they're going to take some actions that are not explicitly anti-immigrant, but they might make their base feel good, because now their base feels like, yeah, now you're going to go into the businesses and you're going to make sure that we're being hired instead of them. Yet this base might not be thinking long-term. Is it that you want to just work for these other people? Do you want to work for these white people? Most of the people who own the commerce in South Africa are white, or just bourgeoisie population. Is that where you want to stop? Or do you want to stop at a point where you're able to say, it's not relevant because I can control my own economic destinies. We as a people can, instead of relying on our oppressors to employ us. Something that we do all the time throughout the African experience, throughout the African world. So that's something we're going to talk about today. Before we go that far, let's talk about some news that's happening. There's been some real big news happening inside of the African world. So we're going to talk about news this week, and then we're going to get back and talk about what happened to the land expropriation without compensation bill. All right, everyone. The first thing that we have to talk about, and I say have to because I'm so, I get upset talking about this because it's the never-ending conditions of a white supremacist state that keeps us continually in this position as African people. So there's a recent killing, obviously. I'm sure many of you heard about it. A young man named Amir Locke. And he was killed while he was in his home, or I don't know if it's his home or a friend's or cousin's home. He was basically subject to the no-knock warrants. And because of that, he was sleeping whenever the cops busted in his house. And when you're asleep and you wake up, you might be like delirious, right? He, obviously being fearful for his life, started reaching for his gun. And guess what? Got shot up by the police, who didn't announce themselves. who busted into the house like they have a right. And here we are again. It's out of the same situation, despite the fact that the Breonna Taylor murders happen. People are still being subjected to these Gestapo tactics by the white supremacist state. So let's just talk a little bit about it. The parents, let me take a little tea. Actually, y'all, my voice is not too good today. The parents of Amir Locke, a 22-year-old Black man, fatally shot by police in a Minneapolis apartment during a no-knock warrant execution, said Friday that he had obtained a gun legally after a conversation with the family. I want to emphasize the legal because there's that very interesting, if you look up the Hill, they're probably one of the better news outlets. Not that I agree with all their politics or people's politics on there, but they report pretty well compared to like CNN and MSNBC and all these other places. But they went into detail about how, despite the fact that there's all these African men who are killed by the police who are legally holding guns. You know, you have a right, a Second Amendment right, that the NRA, the biggest organization, the biggest political organization in the country that we know is white supremacist, has consistently been quiet and scared to take any position to say that, hey, you have a right to a gun whenever you're Black, because we know that really whenever they created a Second Amendment, it was not created for us. Trust me, if they thought that they were advocating for a Second Amendment for us, we would have seen a very different looking Second Amendment, like a Second Amendment for only people who are of a certain complexion or something like that. It was no intention in their minds that they would be arming the people who they had envisioned being slaves forever. So that's something to keep in mind as people. Like, we think that we get a gun and we're protecting ourselves automatically, but let's just also be aware that that gun in itself, in their eyes, you don't have a right. You don't have a right to bear arms. You don't have a right to legally own. So that's not protection in itself. The ultimate protection that we can strive for and build is protection amongst ourselves. We had a movement trying to push for a Black militia that has been completely taken out by the FBI prosecuting Grandmaster Jay. Whatever you feel about his politics, it was a movement to get people together with their being armed instead of by themselves. We need to think collectively inside of that regard. We can't think individually. You know, I think give us a false sense of pride, a false sense of security. Like, okay, I got my gun. The cops come after me. I'm good. No, unfortunately, if you might be okay inside of certain circumstances, there's certainly people who having that being armed saved them from the police in certain circumstances, but that's very few and far between. And to them, you don't have a right to bear arms as an African person. There's no, I got this gun legally. It's only you basically, if anything, you might escape scrutiny if the cops aren't around to see the murder. But if they're there, they see you armed, they see you basically as any N-word carrying a gun. So going on, it says he made sure that he did his research. Everything was going to be legal. That's what his mother said. He did his research. Because they've been watching all their lives about what has been unfolding throughout this nation on our Black male, she said. The parents said the conversations with Amir and his older brother are often about how to interact with police so that he can live to see another day. Unfortunately, parents, I don't think there's necessarily a answer, one overall answer about how do we interact with police. You can be peaceful. You can pose no threat. You can be armed legally. There's no really a good way to talk to. I kind of cringe when I hear people say I have to talk to my child. We're living under like I said, a Gestapo military occupation. You can do everything right, check off the boxes, and still be subject to these types of murders. So, definitely keep the family in prayer. They said that they recently arrested the person who was supposed to be the aim of the no-knock warrant. It was not Amir Locke. I don't even think it was the person who owned the apartment. In fact, this is how reckless they are. You know, how reckless and how negligent that these police are. Unfortunately, there's going to now be the common having all of these people swoop in, whether it's Benjamin Crump. Well, yeah, the family's represented by Benjamin Crump. I heard D-Ray yesterday on Black Power Media said D-Ray is going to be inside of the fold. Now we basically have the vultures coming out to get their moment. But I bet you none of these people, Benjamin Crump, D-Ray, or anyone, are going to have the real conversation that we have to have as a people. That conversation is, What are we going to do about the fact that we're not organized as a people to defend ourselves? Why? How is it that we've come from a point where we come from a legacy of people like the Deacons of Defense and the Black Panther Party who were organized and armed to the point where the police knew they couldn't just barge inside of your apartment and just, start going haywire, right? But we've gone from that legacy to being basically completely unarmed, or then people who are armed, we're not inside of an organized fashion. You're not going to hear Benjamin Crump talking about this. You're not going to hear D-Ray talking about this. So what has to happen is that for our people, we have to get organized in that type of way so that we can protect ourselves, be proactive, don't be reactive. Yes, it's a horrible tragedy. We hope that the person gets the ultimate penalty, whoever shot the guns. I haven't seen any names released or whatever. But we also know that justice, there's no such thing as justice. The man is dead, right? He's already dead. The only justice that can come is actually changing things before they happen. And I think that if we as a people start taking moves differently, we'll honor people like Amir Locke and so many others before him. The list is countless. We'll honor them in a special way because we'll show them that their deaths cause us to organize and mobilize to not have another death. Instead of us focusing on, is the conviction going to happen? Is it not going to happen? And then we get upset, because most times it doesn't happen. And then we start rioting, and the next thing we know, someone else is dead. All that in between, we had time to get together and mobilize, but did not. That's the problem with the way that this Black Lives Matter movement at this point. I don't know what's happening with them, but that's the problem with the way that it has had us moving. It's had us moving basically on our emotions instead of moving on our logic, our sense, and our capabilities to get together and figure out better solutions. So, definitely keep the family in prayer, and hopefully, for the people of Minneapolis, we are going to see some real strategic organizational structures that will hopefully inspire other communities, not just in America, but throughout the world, because we know police brutality is international. So another story we're going to talk about next is what's happening in Haiti. Y'all, Haiti, it's just so crazy to see a country that continually has to deal with so much, and yet these imperialists somehow always escape scrutiny. So basically right now, the interim president of Haiti, his name, Ariel Henry, he is believed, and really good evidence to say that this is true, he's believed to have basically conspired with the United States government to assassinate Jovenel Moïse. Jovenel Moïse, the previous president of Haiti, we know he was assassinated last year. We know he was not loved by the people. We know that he was not a legitimate leader. He was not really president at that time because his term had expired. Yet the United States kept him around until he was no longer useful to them. So they had him exterminated. That's the facts that have come out so far. So this is a good interview that I encourage you all, or a good article. It's an interview with the article. But basically, it looks like that the current president is not going anywhere. So Ariel Henry said that I'm not going anywhere until we've held elections by the end of the year. Well, Henry is promising elections that will be held by the end of the year. That's probably not going to happen. According to the person they were interviewing, Henry said on Monday that he is the best bet to stay on for stability, even though he recognizes his legitimacy was in question from the get-go. He added that since Monday was the last day that would have been Jovenel Moïse's term, Henry's position is now unconstitutional, so it's being argued, but that there is no constitutional pathway out. So the reason is because he wasn't elected in the first place. America, the country that seems to think that they can intervene in people's elections, and yet if someone starts a Facebook page to basically infiltrate their elections, they cry foul. America has been all up in Haiti's politics, obviously, for decades. And so now we're inside of a point now where the people of Haiti suffered so much under this other U.S. puppet. They got rid of him. And instead of allowing for, quote unquote, an election, they appointed who they wanted to be the successor to Jovenel Moïse. And so now this person doesn't want to get out of his position. He's saying, I'm gonna hold elections, but people are saying that's probably not going to happen. And now we are basically inside of a furtherance of the colonial state that already existed with Jovenel Moïse, because the United States is still empowered, or still the ones who are controlling things. And yet our people, once again, we're not inside of control of our political destiny. So this is something, just an update on Haiti. very crazy things that are constantly happening inside of that country because of the imperialist occupation. So what we ultimately have to stand in solidarity with the people of Haiti is that we see true liberation. An organization, COSTA, is going to be having African Liberation Day in Haiti, I believe, this year. So I'll definitely share some more information about that, because we want to stand with the people of Haiti and make sure that their voices are being heard. We understand who their enemies are. Their enemies are our enemies. And for that reason, we have to amplify the fact that not only is the United States constantly sabotaging their liberation, but they're actively working to put people inside of the political arena who are going to not even care about what happens to the people, are going to be fully concerned with what is the U.S. interest inside of the country. That's something that none of us have ever had to completely live under. We lived under prototypes of that. You know, we have Black leaders who are sponsored, but imagine, like, even those that are sponsored, you don't even get to say whether or not they're going to represent you, because some white man basically puts them inside of your community and says, you don't have to vote. This is going to be your leader. That's what Haiti's been dealing with for a long time. So let's definitely keep staying in solidarity with our people in Haiti. Last thing I want to talk about, this is, I guess, more on a positive end. These other stories, probably not so much. But this is something that happened in the African Union this week. If I can find the article. Let's see. There we go. I think this is it. Okay, here we go. So there has been a lot of fuss in the African Union about Israel's planned observer status, and this is something that's very good, that we should definitely praise, because even though the African Union is full of political chumps, let's be real, there's enough voices that are anti-Israel observer status. Israel observer status would be the ultimate slap in the face of Africa, in my opinion. These people actively worked to uphold colonial regimes from South Africa to Algeria. They've actively worked to sabotage our movements. Even in the United States, we find out that the police forces that are using these Gestapo tactics are being trained in Israel. So this country has always stood against the Pan-Africanist African Liberation Movement. And by the way, look it up. The ADF, Anti-Defamation League in America, spied on Dr. Martin Luther King. This is one of the most powerful organizations in the United States, and they spied on Dr. King. Dr. King, peaceful, lovable Dr. King. Why would they do that? It's like I said, the Zionists have consistently voiced opposition to our liberation because they understand that they have a direct incentive to our continual captivity. They also understand that if we become free, then there might be some push to make Palestine free. So they've always tried to sabotage any movements that we have. So having your enemy literally in the African Union, having someone that advocated for apartheid sitting inside of African Union, advocated for apartheid in South Africa, and yet is also practicing apartheid in Israel and Palestine. That person inside of your formation that's supposed to be for unity and liberation, that's what they say that they're for, but they're far from that. That would be a direct slap in the face to all of Africa. So it's been reported, Palestinian Minister Mohammed Shetye on Saturday called on the African Union to withdraw Israel's observer status, stressing that accepting it as observer in the African Union will be an unmerited reward for the violations and apartheid regime imposes on Palestinian people. It's been reported that even before he voiced this, people like Cyril Ramaphosa have said that Israel is not welcome in the African Union. Let's watch some of this video.
With regards to the admission of Israel as an observer at the AU, we've expressed our deep concern about that because it's a decision that was taken by the chair of the commission and without consulting the member states. Certainly we were not consulted. We have views because we are concerned about what is happening in Palestine. The continued situation there in Palestine, in our view, militates against just warmly accepting Israel as an observer in Africa, particularly in view of the positions and the views that we have taken ourselves as a country against the state of Israel on this issue. So we are opposed to their admission. We are concerned about the decision that has been made. And as it is now, a number of countries on the continent are expressing their unhappiness and dissatisfaction.
So this is something that's good, obviously. Now, this is Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, the president, who is another sellout, right? But let's give him credit. You know, he's actually saying something that's true. You know, so Israel should not have observer status inside of the African Union, period. What was the point of even asking for this observer status? And what was the point of agreeing to it? What benefit did you have for Africans to allow a country that has literally been accused of spying on different leaders? What reason would you allow them to have observer status in the African Union? So this is just some good news, let you know that basically it's been delayed, I believe, till next year, given all of the backlash inside of the African Union, a lot of disturbances, a lot of arguing, a lot of fighting amongst different African countries whenever they try to approve Israel's observer status is being delayed. So it's going to come up again. Hopefully not when people aren't paying attention and not watching, because literally when people delay things that are contentious, it's like, let's let them settle down so that we can sneak this in when we want it to be done. So definitely continue. If people on the African continent continue to put pressure on your leaders about this atrocious action being done by some puppets in the African Union and try to push for Israel to have observer status there. So with that, I think that we can go back to the story at hand, and that is what happened to the EFF. All right, everyone. So like I said, I think the big reason of which EFF might be making a hard turn has a lot to do with the land expropriation without compensation falling away, basically. So let's look a little bit at what happened. I didn't talk about this. I don't know if I was on break, but I didn't talk about this. Actually, do I want to talk about this first? Yeah, let's talk about this first. I just also want to give you another example of how the EFF has been basically backing things that might not be really for us necessarily. So this is something I've seen come out. Basically, the economic fighters, freedom fighters, said that they are slamming PSL's cowardice over the opening of stadiums. And I did want to just briefly talk about this because I think it's another good example of taking stances that might be good for your election prospects, but not even doing anything to tip the scales as far as African liberation. So since March 2020, fans have been restricted from attending games in South Africa due to the coronavirus pandemic. South African opposition politician Julius Malema has questioned the logic behind allowing stadiums to be open for political events, while fans remain barred from attending football matches. When addressing a rally organized by his political party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, Malema blasted the hosting of non-football events as nonsense. The PSL clubs have been playing behind closed doors since the implementation of the lockdown regulations in March 2020 following the COVID-19 outbreak, but political events have been held in the stadium, which I agree doesn't make sense. But he says, we call on the leadership of the PSL to stop being scared and cowardice and challenge this government. We must not seek to be liked. It must be challenged for opening the stadiums. Political parties have been filling stadiums, but stadiums are not open for entertainment. Why is the PSL leadership quiet while the political parties are being in stadiums, yet soccer clubs are not allowed to be at stadiums? This is absolute nonsense. They destroy the only bread that the people of South Africa have. We want to have our soccer back. We want our entertainment back. We want our festivals back. We want the economy open for all of us, for the youth of KwaZulu-Natal to get jobs back. Now, the problem I have with this stance also is it depends on how you're viewing the EFF. We understand it, and I think the point of this video is that, if anything, let's view them as a political party and not as a political movement to unseat colonialism. Political parties will appeal to things that will get the support of the people. So, for example, they had a protest about this outside the stadium, open the stadiums, and you see people carrying signs like, I want to see my football. Now, that might be how many South Africans feel, but if we're actually critical of the role that sports play inside of countries, Many of us will agree that the role that sports play is basically to silence us, to keep us distracted. I mean, I will see people living in the worst conditions and they're so worried about the Super Bowl, who's going to win, and putting bets on that. I will see people who never a day in their life have gone to an organizational meeting, yet they are constantly watching football, going to the bar to watch football, going to their friend's house to watch football. Like, the way that sports have kept us hypnotized, I believe it's very intentional. You know, that's something that we don't talk about, we don't analyze, because a lot of people don't want to hear it. Like, a lot of people don't want to hear that, hey, you being so concerned about the stats of all these teams, that's literally something that your oppressor is doing, so that you're not concerned about the stats of the corporations that are coming in your communities and raiding you. That's something that I believe is very intentional, because even if you look at a country, look at the history of these empires, these very barbaric empires. They've all been like very big sports empires. Think of the Roman Empire. Literally, you had all of these people who were so interested in seeing these like these duels between, you know, the different garrisons and stuff like that. Many of whom were poor, some were not. And they would be so happy, forgetting the fact that they are poor, they are hungry. They're so happy to watch these sports. So it does play a direct role in hypnotizing the people. And the issue with this type of protest, like I said, many of these types of protests, is that we're forgetting the fact that our oppressors have a direct incentive to keep us literally focused on things that don't go to the colonial situation. Whether or not the stadiums are open is not going to change the conditions of South Africans. Sure, maybe some people will be able to go back to work. But again, we're working inside of stadiums that are built by the colonial state, teams that are going to be controlled by colonial entities. Do we understand how all of these sports teams that exploit our labor, many of them, if not most or almost all of them, are being funded by corporate capitalists? And so even the attending and giving our money to these sports arenas, like we're literally seeing people who have not our best interest in mind profiting from us. So that was another issue. And there was another one last year. I think I did do a video on it, where basically you seen the EFF protesting skin lightening. Now that one I was a little bit more not skin lightening. There was an ad, it was a racist ad, and they protested it. And that one, even back then, I was saying, you know, well, I understand how you would have an issue with this racist ad depicting African hair, African woman as not beautiful. Let's not forget that land expropriation without compensation, though, because I personally, like, as much as I see racist ads and I see like Eurocentric standards, that's not something that I'm focused on. I'm focused on sovereignty. I'm focused on what is it that we have to do to free ourselves. Like, these are things that European system is always going to do. They'll always find a way to do it, even if it's not as bold as some other ways. So it's not going to change. But what can change is the conditions that we're living under. But that's, again, what happens whenever we focus and we protest things that are not directly to the center of power. The center of power is the colonial state. That's where our energy should be. That's where our focus should be. That's where our studies should be. That's the EFF. I've not seen too many people that has the ability to leverage that amount of people, like as Malay was able to in the African continent. I've not seen it in a while. You know, it's been a while. And the fact that that is such a powerful thing to have, that you have so much respect and love from the people that you can drive them towards things. And the things are not going, at one point it was almost like it was going to go towards the land, but just randomly, like it's going towards things that have no causal relationship to the land. That's something that's concerning, but that's something that's political. And that's why, again, I said, if anything that we get from this video, the EFF is not a political movement of the people. It's a political party in South Africa. So again, let's go back to the land expropriation without compensation conversation. I'll share my screen. Okay, here we go. All right, so South Africa law changed plans to allow land expropriation. Land expropriation fails to pass. I don't know if you remember this. I did talk about it before it completely failed, because there's a lot of debates going on. Basically, understandably, we know that the ANC was trying to not have something that was going to strip the corporate capitalists of their land to the point where they would basically leave South Africa, and basically would allow South Africa to now be a pariah in the international community. This is something that was being argued about. The EFF wanted something more concrete. So let's read. A proposal to change South Africa's constitution to explicitly allow expropriation of land with no compensation failed to win 2/3 of parliamentary votes that it needed on Tuesday. lawmakers debated whether to change Section 25 of the Constitution to enable authorities to seize land to address racial land inequalities left over from colonialism and the white minority rule. Redressing them has been a flagship promising of the ruling ANC, but little progress has been made on it nearly 3 decades since the end of apartheid. And this is something that should be noted that is, I think, very much to the EFF's credit, is that they pushed the issue of land expropriation without compensation so hard that the ANC, was something that was the Revolutionary Party that now became a political bourgeoisie elitist party, they had to adopt it. Now they're not going to adopt it fully. In fact, my next article for WC, I'm going to talk about how, in my opinion, like there's not going to be no land expropriation without compensation in South Africa, the country South Africa. It would have to be without the country that was negotiated by Nelson Mandela. But again, the ANC was willing to take it, even though a watered down version of what the EFF was asking for. Now, just to scroll down some more, it says, in all, 204 lawmakers backed the amendment, 145 voted against it. It says that, okay, I'm trying to get to the debate part of it, which I think is in this article. Okay, let's read this. It says, today we stand to complete the fight against the original sin of land dispossession. This was said by Justice Minister Roland Lamola. He said the state was targeting land only under special conditions, but such as having a long time informal occupants, being unused, and being purely for speculation or being abandoned. But it was rejected by the ANC's opponent on both sides of the spectrum. So they had the Democratic Alliance, which is basically the whites who are in South Africa, the right-wing Freedom Front Plus view the plan as an assault on property rights. They think they have a right to the property of the indigenous South Africans, even though they stole it. While the Marxist EFF, which voted against it, wants the state to take control of the land. So this fails, and this obviously is a huge disappointment, because if you don't know, this was something that was in the working for a long time. The ANC took a position that they would be willing to start having conversations about land expropriation. I believe it was like 3-4 years ago. And since then, they've been going and debating. It's like, how are we going to do this? How are we going to do this? EFF wants this. ANC wants this. The white Democratic Alliance, they want none of it. So going back and forth. Of course, ANC wanted to take steps that were not going to completely divest the corporate interest of their land. EFF was more for that, and it fails. Now, when something like this fails, after years of push, years of fighting, years of public statements being made, that, in my opinion, is a huge crush to the fan base, not the fan base, keep saying fan base, the political base of the EFF, who has been believing and waiting and seeing that, okay, were we getting closer? Are we actually going to have this? You know, is the ANC starting to talk about it? Are we actually going to have control of our land back? And then it fails. So what's the option now? You go back to start from scratch? Do you start debating it all over again? Is it going to take another 3 years? That's something that many people don't have. Many people don't have time to start from scratch with these constitutional amendments. You know, it's a very tedious process, as we saw play out over years of these debates between the EFF and the ANC. That, in my opinion, is probably a lot to do with the EFF taking different positions that don't go necessarily to their brand. Their brand being we want our land back. Their brand being we're going to seize the land. But here they are going through the democratic process, and the land is less likely to go and fall into the hands of the people who are their political base. So here you are adopting policies, adopting things that are not going to go to the colonial situation and don't further Pan-Africanism, don't further African liberation. But they appease your base, because Native South Africans, they would like more of their jobs back from the Zimbabweans. Many of them don't want Zimbabweans and Nigerians to even be in South Africa. So you're going in there and saying, okay, we're going to make sure South Africans are employed there. Hey, it might make you look bad inside of certain ways, but it will appeal to your base. Then you go into talking about, oh, this school is racist. They kick these people out. Okay, absolutely. You're in a racist country, so that's unacceptable. But throwing the protest towards that, then you also had the Zuma protest, despite the fact that the EFF basically fought to oust Zuma. Many people liked him and many people supported him. So then with his incarceration, then you have them basically meeting with Zuma, saying that he shouldn't have been arrested. I mean, I personally am not a fan of, you know, putting people in jail for whenever you have the white occupiers still running around, said that you never put in jail. But a lot of people felt the same way. Same thing with this stadium. A lot of people want to go back to watching football. Do you understand, like, the trend I'm trying to show you? The trend is that there are things that the people want in their right here and now, but their long-term interests are not going to be met under the colonial constitutional situation in South Africa. So a political party, as opposed to a revolutionary grassroots organization, a political party has to make concessions to do things to get the people on their side because they need votes to survive. In fact, I think I have one story about, let's see. I think I have a story about, yeah, I actually do. Let me open this now. I have a part of a story that kind of goes into some of the political issues as far as trying to get people to vote for the EFF. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, here we go. Okay, how fast would the ANC fall? Part 3. The party's calls tell a turbocharged story. Now, it should also be said the ANC also is very unpopular, but the result that we've seen, we haven't necessarily seen South Africans, you know, stop voting, switch parties necessarily. More so, you see people becoming disengaged with the political process. And in my opinion, we should all be disengaged with these political processes. That's really what I'm going to end up this video, you know, explaining. But, you know, the ANC suffered its first serious election defeat in 2016. Its losses were so unexpected. Nobody seriously contemplated interfering with the peaceful transfers of municipal power. And a few outgoing mayors were too hungover. Julius Malema's Economic Fighters League had their own surprise in store when they backed the Democratic Alliance, again, that's the white supremacist party inside of South Africa, candidates against the ANC. Since the EFF and the DA have nothing in common, EFF leaders explained the decision as a vote against the ANC. Another thing that politics, as opposed to grassroots organizing, is prepared to do. You're willing to back these people more so to protest the clinch of power that the ANC has inside of the country. Yet the Democratic Alliance, you know, you really don't want them to be elected, right? Like they're the white supremacists that are basically like, we're keeping our land. We don't care. We don't care about how you are starving. We want to keep our land and whatnot. And it's like, it's not your land to begin with, but whatever. Former President Jacob Zuma is gone, yet the EFF backed the Democratic Alliance a second time in 2021. Why? Though there is a personal element, Malema has a grudge against President Cyril Ramaphosa for kicking him out of the ANC. The long-term strategy is unchanged. The Malema aims to break the ANC as a national force in 2024 or 2029. If he succeeds, he hopes to brush the DA aside. So basically, a relationship of convenience, right? If no party has 51%, there will be a rush to coalesce with whoever needs it. Whatever he needs. If the ANC divisions have advanced to the point of splitting the party, the EFF will absorb the radical economic transformation faction. So the populist alternative to the current political impasse is the EFF. With or without the RET, EFF-RET policies would inspire capital flight, because investors will fear their assets will be confiscated. A failed state will be a real possibility, but the EFF is not that strong. Fear that the EFF reminds me of an exaggerated fears of the anti-apartheid Afrikaners. There's one part I'm trying to get to. I don't see it. Let's see. I think you get the point, though. The point that the article is trying to make is that basically the EFF has a vision that they're going to overtake South Africa and be the ruling party. And unfortunately, they have not met that yet. And so now they're taking concessions and doing things that will probably not be in our interest, you know, doing things that will go probably contrary to our interest. I'm going to go through one more article that I want to show you just to draw a difference or show the difference of how political organizations move versus how national political parties move versus grassroots parties will move when they're trying to really obtain liberation, because political parties will have to basically, like I said, make very many concessions. So this last article talks about some relationships with the EFF that I've been aware of, but like I said, I've also known that there's positives with the EFF, but there's also some concerning things. A lot of people were asking in 2016 why Julius Malema met with a guy named Lord Robin Renwick. He is someone who's very much known for not just working to keep the land out of the hands of the people of Zimbabwe, but also working really hard to ensure that that whenever Mandela became president, that the whites kept their land, or kept our land, really. And Malema met with him, and a lot of people were concerned about that. I'm going to read just a little bit of this article. During 2015, the top leadership of the ostensible Marxist-Leninist Parliamentary Party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, led by its commander-in-chief, Julius Malema, took a tour to London where they met, amongst others, Lord Robin Renwick. The meeting with Renwick and other representative of imperialism happened under the secret rule called the Chatham House Rule. Up until now, no one knows what was said between the EFF and representatives of British colonialism. The media is also not interested to ask relevant questions. What is known is that after the meeting, Robin Renwick and other EFFs changed its policy in a number of significant ways. Renwick gloats about being the man who converted Mandela from demanding nationalization of the economy to becoming a servant of capitalism and private property. Since meeting Renwick, the EFF has been quiet on things like land expropriation without compensation, and nationalization. The EFF has been focused on the Guptas must go and Zuma must fall campaigns, which are in turn fully supported by British and Afrikaner imperialism. That's something that I think also goes to the point that we're really in doubt. The EFF's problem is that the EFF is a political party. Political parties need money. Money comes from people who are not for us. That's why I think ultimately we have to turn away from this idea that our constitutions have to be the prototype of how we get power. The Constitution of South Africa was written by people who intentionally never meant for us to have control of the land, always meant for us to be marginalized from the economy of the country, always meant for the continuance of apartheid. How is it that we can strive to change a country when a constitution is going to be honored and adhered to? You'll have to make concessions. That's the literal political reality that every single person faces whenever they want to run for election. We've all experienced this. If you're in the United States, you've experienced this. You have someone that might start off as a political organizer, very much connected to the people. Then they have an idea. I want to run for president, or I want to run for city council. I want to run for mayor, whatever. Then you see that person become very much like just a very vanilla person. Like they don't have any strong convictions about the conditions of the people anymore. Now they want to do things like, oh, we have to get healthcare for everyone. Well, okay, while you're trying to do that, seeing that has failed, seeing that you don't have any concrete plans, what about the fact that this is happening in our community? But they'll take the liberal talking points to say, oh, we're going to, get more access to jobs. We're going to get these things. This happens consistently inside of the election process. So really, I would end this video with saying what happened to the EFF is that the EFF was set up to basically become what they are becoming already, by way of trying to get liberation through the Constitution of South Africa instead of through the people taking and seizing control of their land. There's never been a situation where you can basically vote your way out of oppression. That's just not going to happen. You're not going to vote your way out of landlessness. You're going to get your way out of it whenever you're organized and able to push and leverage for it on your own. The unfortunate thing is that there are many organizations inside of South Africa that do have radical politics like this. But I think one of the things that unfortunately people take for granted is that whenever you're putting all your focus and your hope into a political party, you're going to ignore and even forsake the organizers many times, who would be your best prospect for liberation. Liberation doesn't necessarily have to start with getting a constitutional amendment passed. The liberation that I think South African people are asking for is basic. This is our land. This is not being controlled. This is not even being used. Much of the land by this 10% white majority is not even being used. And yet we're put inside of these shacks. Let's go and take our land back. Yet whenever they try to do that, you have people pacify and say, don't do it. That's the way we're going to do this, a constitutional way. The constitutional way has never worked inside of the colonial state. The constitutional way is often made to uphold the colonial state. In fact, the interesting thing about this guy, Lord Renwick, is that he had a lot to say with the South African Constitution, because in his mind, we're going to basically create a constitution that's going to allow white minority rule of the economy, and yet people are still living under this constitution in a majority Black country. So I say this to say, in my opinion, and this is, like I said, my next article is going to touch on this. We have to stop looking at these political parties, period. EFF still, I'm sure, will do some good, and I'm sure they'll still have some type of voice. But the fact is that we have to turn our attention away from these political entities that are still having to comply with the rules of the state, be it getting money from our colonizers, be it taking stances that might not actually be Pan-Africanist, taking stances that do not go directly to the colonial system. We have to start drawing away from that, start drawing towards ourselves. And I very much promise you, if the people who are oppressed come together with one mind to say that we have to get freedom by any means necessary, you'll get your land back a lot quicker than going through these constitutional amendments with people who are controlled by the same white elite that you're trying to take your land back from. So that's all I have for this video. Let me see if there's any questions in the comment section. I don't see any, but I thank you all for joining. I love to see your comments on this. Really, what do you think happened to the EFF? Do you think I'm wrong? Do you think the EFF is still on the right page and I'm just like being negative? All of this is positive dialogue, so I'm for it all. But with that, I will see you on the next video.